They'll let anyone sit up here now, even the help. That's what the white man in seat 1B said, loud enough for 3 rows to hear, calm enough that you knew he meant every word, and sharp enough to slice through the soft hum of the first-class cabin like a blade. Dr. Benjamin Ellis had just placed his briefcase in the overhead bin and was easing into seat 1A when those words landed. Not as a question, not as a joke, but as a verdict. Cold, casual, condescending. The kind of comment that doesn't just aim to insult, it aims to erase, to declare, without hesitation, that a black man in a tailored navy blazer and polished shoes doesn't belong in first class unless he's pushing the drink cart. Before we go on, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And if you believe dignity isn't about seat numbers or skin color, hit like and subscribe, because what happened next on Flight 227 left first class speechless. It was a Thursday afternoon in July. The sky over Chicago was clear, with just enough wind to cool the sidewalks but not delay flights. Benjamin Ellis, 55 years old, wasn't in a rush. He had just wrapped up a keynote lecture at the University of Chicago Law School, titled, ironically, "The Quiet Cost of Respect." He had been invited to speak on civil rights in the legal system, not because of a title, but because of lived truth, decades of experience in courtrooms, classrooms, and Congress. He had worked under 2 administrations, consulted for the Justice Department, and written books that were being taught in universities he could never have entered as a student when he was a child. That afternoon, he was flying home to New York, seat 1A, paid in full by the university, no upgrade, no favor, just a receipt, a name, and a flight number. He boarded without fanfare, briefcase in hand, smile soft but polite. As he stepped into the first-class cabin of American Airlines Flight 227, he nodded to the flight attendant, Maya Rodriguez, who gave him a quick glance and an automatic smile, already busy preparing pre-takeoff service. He turned left, found his row, and stepped into the aisle beside seat 1A. That's when he saw him. Peter Langston, white, late 60s, former military, based on the patches on his carry-on and the stiff pride in his posture, wearing a navy golf shirt with an eagle embroidered near the collar and khakis that looked pressed by routine. He looked up at Benjamin, not with surprise, but with a kind of quiet resentment, the way someone might look at a stranger sitting in their pew at church. Benjamin, unfazed, placed his briefcase into the overhead bin and carefully sat down. And that's when it happened, the moment that changed everything. They'll let anyone sit up here now, even the help. Benjamin didn't speak. Not yet. He simply turned his head. His expression didn't shift. His eyes were steady, the kind you only earn after learning how to carry your dignity through rooms not built for you. He looked Peter dead in the face, waiting for a follow-up. There wasn't one. Just silence. A heavy one. The woman in 2A slowly looked up from her phone. A man in 3C shifted in his seat and paused his podcast. The air in the cabin got noticeably thinner. Peter cleared his throat. First class used to mean something, he added, folding his arms. Now they just give it away to checkboxes. Equity, diversity, whatever you people want to call it. It's not earned anymore. It's handed out. This time. Benjamin blinked. Once. Then gently reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out his boarding pass. He laid it across the armrest, face up, in plain view. Seat 1A, Dr. Benjamin Ellis, paid ticket, no apology. Peter didn't look at it. "I'm not questioning your ticket," he muttered. "I'm questioning the standard. You know what I mean?" Benjamin tilted his head slightly, studying him like a teacher deciding whether to correct a student now or wait until the end of class. A few rows back, someone whispered, "Did he really just say that?" Maya, the flight attendant, appeared beside the row. Her smile was tight now, and she stood with just enough stiffness to suggest she'd overheard more than she wanted to. "Gentlemen," she said softly, "is everything all right here?" Peter didn't hesitate. "I think this man might be in the wrong section." Maya turned to Benjamin. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Benjamin handed it over wordlessly. She glanced down, her eyes scanning the details. Then she looked up and gave the faintest nod. "You're right where you're supposed to be. Dr. Ellis." She returned the pass and stepped back. No further comment. No apology to him. Nothing said to the man who'd launched the whole exchange. Peter smirked. "Like I said, even the help." Benjamin said nothing, because sometimes silence is the loudest form of truth. And sometimes, the real turbulence doesn't come from the skies. It starts on the ground, right before the cabin door closes. And this flight was just getting started. The silence after Maya walked away wasn't calm. It was charged, uncomfortable, like the stillness before a storm that everyone senses but pretends not to see. Benjamin Ellis sat with perfect posture, hands resting on the armrest, not fidgeting, not sighing, just present, as if even his stillness was an act of quiet protest. But behind the silence, the weight of that moment spread like a ripple. The woman in 2A, mid-30s, blonde hair tied back, had lowered her phone completely now. Her name was Kelly Burns, a project manager flying to New York for a conference on digital finance. And although she'd trained herself to mind her business on flights, something about what she'd just witnessed wouldn't let her look away. A row behind her sat Anthony Price, a black man in his late 30s dressed in business casual, shirt sleeves rolled up, laptop bag tucked beneath the seat in front of him. He'd seen enough in his own career to recognize exactly what had just happened up front, and it made his stomach twist. He looked down at the armrest between his seat and the empty one next to him, then up at Benjamin. He wanted to say something, but the words didn't form. That was the thing about moments like this. They rarely asked for opinions. They just demanded courage. Meanwhile, Peter Langston had leaned back in his seat like a man who had just won something. He folded his arms again, let out a slight breath through his nose, and gave a slight nod of satisfaction, as if the fact that Maya hadn't corrected him somehow proved his point. Linda Langston, seated beside him in 1C across the aisle, gave him a faint look, half annoyance, half agreement, but said nothing. She'd learned a long time ago that Peter didn't need much to start, and even less to keep going. Maya, now at the front of the cabin, quietly took a water bottle and wiped down the counter, her eyes darting occasionally toward 1A, her face a mix of regret and restraint. She'd wanted to say more, but there were protocols, and when you were a woman of color in uniform, sometimes doing your job meant surviving it first. Benjamin finally broke his stillness, not with words, but by slowly pulling a slim black folder from his briefcase and resting it on the tray table in front of him. Inside was a speech draft, a few handwritten notes, and a photo his daughter had slipped in before he left. Her in her graduation gown, beaming beside him outside Columbia. He let his eyes rest on it for just a second before closing the folder gently. It was a reminder of why he didn't respond to men like Peter with volume. Because every time someone tried to drag him backward, he chose to move forward quietly, with dignity, not noise, but still. That didn't mean he hadn't heard every word. Peter, of course, wasn't finished. Turning slightly in his seat, his voice dropped, but not by much. "You know," he muttered, "back when I served, men earned their stripes. Didn't matter what you looked like, black, white, brown. What mattered was whether you bled for the country, not some handout degree or politics class." Benjamin turned his head slowly, his gaze level. "What exactly do you think I do, Mr. Langston?" Peter replied quickly. Peter Langston, retired Air Force, small business owner, real estate. And you? Benjamin nodded once. Dr. Benjamin Ellis, professor of law, Columbia University, former legal advisor to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. The way he said it, unapologetically, with precision, felt like a clean sheet of glass being set gently on the table between them. Peter blinked, clearly surprised by the credentials, but not enough to back down. Ah, he said, dragging out the vowel. One of those professors, the kind always telling people what's racist and what's not. I've read about your kind, always seeing problems where there aren't any. No, Benjamin said, voice low and calm. I don't create problems, Mr. Langston. I name them, and naming something doesn't make it appear. It just means someone finally stopped pretending it wasn't there. A hush swept over the front rows again. Even Kelly, still pretending to scroll her phone, felt the temperature shift. Peter sat back, but the tension between the two men hadn't broken. It had simply matured into something harder to ignore. Anthony, from his seat behind, leaned forward just slightly and whispered toward Benjamin's row. Sir, I just want to say, I saw what happened, and I respect how you handled it. Benjamin turned, offering a small nod, appreciative but brief. Thank you, he said. Not the first time? Won't be the last? Kelly looked up, and for the first time, she spoke. Honestly, I didn't know what to say, but that wasn't okay. Peter turned his head toward her. It's first class, he said. Not a debate club. No, Kelly said, her voice clear. It's a plane, and everyone paid to be here. That's what should matter. Peter didn't respond. Linda, across the aisle, was staring out the window now. She didn't want to get pulled into this, not with strangers, not with her husband, but deep down. Even she knew the old rules they'd lived by weren't holding up the way they used to. Maya reappeared with a tray of drinks and asked if anyone would like water or juice. She paused slightly at Benjamin's seat, her voice softer. Anything I can bring you? Dr. Ellis? It wasn't much, but it was the first time someone had said his name aloud since the flight began. Just water, he said gently. Thank you. She handed it to him with a quiet nod and moved on, and for a moment. The cabin was still again, but it was a different kind of still. Not the stillness of avoidance, the stillness of awareness, of reckoning. Because in that space, between seat 1A and 1B, the air had shifted, not because someone got loud, but because someone refused to disappear. Peter Langston wasn't done, not even close, if anything. The quiet responses from Benjamin and the unexpected support from a few fellow passengers had only agitated something inside him. He crossed his arms tighter, leaned slightly toward Benjamin as if proximity could prove a point, and muttered just loud enough to be heard. You know, back when I flew for the military, respect was earned, not handed out because someone cried discrimination. You had to fight for your seat, not sit back and let society bend over backward to give it to you. His tone carried the weight of rehearsed bitterness, like this wasn't the first time he'd said it, maybe not even the 100th. Benjamin didn't flinch. He'd heard every variation of that speech before, on trains, in board meetings, in faculty lounges filled with polished smiles and unspoken judgment. But this moment wasn't about just him. He looked toward Peter calmly and said, I earned this seat the same way I earned everything else in my life, by walking through doors that were built to stay closed. He paused for just a breath. And I didn't need to wear a uniform to serve my country. I served by helping change the laws that failed people who looked like me. The line didn't come from pride. It came from truth. And Peter felt that. His jaw tightened, for the first time since boarding. His eyes lost that smug glint, replaced with something heavier, discomfort. But pride is a stubborn thing, especially when it's bruised. Peter gestured vaguely at the cabin, as if to claim ownership of the space. I'm just saying, this used to be a place where people had class, decorum. Now you get professors lecturing people mid-flight. What's next? A diversity seminar with the complimentary peanuts? The sarcasm didn't land the way he thought it would. Kelly in 2A raised her eyebrows. Anthony shook his head quietly. And from 3B, a soft voice chimed in. Or maybe it's just a place where we stop pretending ignorance is respectable, said Grace Lynn, a quiet woman in her 50s who had remained silent until now. Her tone was calm, but clear. Not everything that makes you uncomfortable is a threat. Sir, Peter turned toward her, startled. I wasn't talking to you. You were talking to all of us, she replied, her voice never rising. Loudly. The moment stretched, and it was in that stretch that the balance of the cabin began to shift. Benjamin said nothing more. He didn't need to. His silence had turned into something bigger than retort. It had become reflection, a mirror that forced everyone nearby to examine what they were actually hearing. Linda, still seated across the aisle, was staring forward with a blank expression. She had heard every word, of course, but now even she seemed unsure whether she still agreed with all of them. Her husband had always been blunt, yes, but in the past. His rants stayed within family rooms and dinner tables. This time, they were out in public, and she could feel the weight of eyes, of quiet judgment, falling back on them both. Peter, sensing his grip slipping, tried again. Look, I'm not saying the man doesn't belong here. I'm just saying there's a reason people get uneasy when things start changing too fast. You mean when people who look like me stop apologizing for existing? Benjamin asked, softly. The words weren't confrontational, but they landed like a hammer on porcelain. For a split second, Peter had no answer. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. Kelly finally leaned forward. It's wild how uncomfortable one quiet black man can make someone like you, she said. He hasn't raised his voice once. You've been the only one making a scene, Peter snapped. I'm not making a scene. I'm standing up for what this country used to be. You mean when seats like that were only filled by people like you? Anthony cut in, his voice now firmer. Yeah, we remember those days too. Some of us lived through the tail end of them. Doesn't mean they were good. Maya, who had been silently monitoring the situation from near the galley, finally stepped forward again. Her expression was no longer one of hesitation, but resolution. Mr. Langston, she said, her voice calm but firm. I'm going to ask you to lower your voice and refrain from further commentary directed at other passengers. If this continues, I'll have to notify the captain. Peter scoffed. Now the flight attendant wants to lecture me too. Maya didn't blink. No, sir. I want to ensure that everyone on this aircraft experiences a safe and respectful environment. That includes Dr. Ellis. That includes you. That includes everyone else on board. Grace gave a slight nod of appreciation. Anthony mouthed, "Thank you." And even Linda, silently, let out a breath she'd been holding. Peter folded his arms and looked away, the silence finally settling over him, not by choice, but by consequence. The shift was subtle, but it was complete. The power in the cabin had moved, not by force, not by title, but by clarity, by truth spoken plainly and quietly enough that everyone could hear it for what it was. Benjamin leaned back in his seat, his gaze returning to the folder on his tray table. He opened it slowly and began reviewing the notes he'd written earlier that day, as if the chaos hadn't touched him at all, but it had, deeply, and yet. He carried himself with the same calm he had entered with. Because for him, dignity was not conditional. It wasn't something to be granted or revoked. It traveled with him. Every room, every flight, every seat. As Maya walked back toward the galley, she paused just long enough to offer Benjamin a nod, one that said, "I see you," and Benjamin, lifting his eyes from the page, nodded back. Nothing else needed to be said. But everyone had heard enough. The flight had barely reached pushback. Yet the emotional turbulence in that first-class cabin had already peaked and stalled like an overloaded engine. But even in that silence, heavy and humming with judgment, something deeper was brewing. Benjamin Ellis didn't raise his voice. He didn't shift in his seat. What he did was reach slowly into his briefcase, unclip a worn black leather folder, and rest it on the tray in front of him. His hands moved with precision, not performance, as if this moment, this exact confrontation, was one he'd prepared for long before he ever boarded this flight. As the folder opened, the cabin's eyes instinctively followed. Inside was a set of crisp printed pages clipped neatly at the top. At first glance, they looked like lecture notes, but the heading at the top read in bold, "United States Commission on Civil Rights, Policy Briefing Docket." Beneath it was a watermark seal, and his name in clean block text, Dr. Benjamin R. Ellis, Senior Legal Advisor. Then came the photo, just a simple 4x6 image tucked inside the cover flap. It showed Benjamin standing beside President Barack Obama at a press conference over a decade ago, with both men shaking hands, smiling broadly. The background was filled with flags and microphones, but what stood out more than anything was the calm in Benjamin's face. The kind of calm earned through struggle, not handed down through comfort. He didn't wave the image around. He didn't even hold it up. He simply let it sit there, open, honest, unshaken. Peter glanced at it once, looked away quickly, then looked again. Squinting, something in his face shifted. Not quite fear, not quite embarrassment, but the confused pause of someone who just realized they've grossly misjudged the weight of the person sitting beside them. And then, finally, Benjamin spoke. His voice was low, steady, and unhurried, as if each syllable had already been weighed before it left his lips. "Mr. Langston," he began, "I don't know what you think first class represents. Maybe to you, it's a reward for hard work, or a symbol of status, or even proof that the world still makes sense the way you wish it did. But to me, this seat, this cabin, this plane, they're just places. Places I pass through like everyone else, with a ticket in my hand and a destination on my calendar. Nothing more. What matters isn't the leather on the seat or the class printed on the boarding pass. It's how we treat each other between takeoff and landing." The entire front of the cabin was silent now. Maya had paused halfway through pouring a drink. Grace had turned fully in her seat to listen. Kelly's phone screen had gone dark in her palm, and even Anthony had closed his laptop. No one interrupted. No one moved. Benjamin continued. "I've spent over 30 years studying systems that were built to reward some and ignore others. I've written legal arguments that have been read by Supreme Court clerks. I've advised 2 administrations, Republican and Democrat, on issues of equity, due process, and access to justice. And I've done all of that while being followed in department stores, while being stopped for no reason on sidewalks, while being asked, more times than I can count, if I work here when I walk into a hotel lobby wearing the same blazer I'm wearing right now." He leaned back slightly, not in defiance, but in truth. "So no, Mr. Langston, I'm not offended by what you said to me. I'm used to it, but I am saddened by it. Saddened that in your world, my presence is still an intrusion. Saddened that your first instinct wasn't to offer a nod or a hello, but to try and reduce me to something smaller, Something easier for you to explain away. Peter's mouth twitched. His shoulders had started to tighten. Not in anger this time, but in the uncomfortable ache of having no rebuttal. Still, Benjamin wasn't finished. And I know what you'll say. That you served. That you bled for this country. That you've earned the right to speak your mind. I respect that service. I do. But respect isn't a trophy that sits on your lap, allowing you to bruise people on the flight home. It's something you carry by how you see others, especially those who don't look like you, especially those who do not yield to your comfort. At that, Linda turned slightly in her seat and looked over at her husband, not sharply, but for the first time, with something resembling distance, like she had never seen him quite as clearly as she did now. Benjamin gently closed the folder in front of him. The gesture was simple, but it felt like the ending of a chapter. You don't have to like me, Mr. Langston. You don't even have to speak to me. But you will respect that I earned my place here, not just on this plane, but in this country, in this field, in every room that once thought someone like me didn't belong. The words didn't thunder. They didn't preach. They just echoed. And in their echo, the entire tone of the cabin changed. Peter didn't speak. He couldn't. His jaw worked like he wanted to say something, but the weight of what had just been said had taken the wind out of him. Maya, standing in the aisle now, let out a breath so subtle it might have gone unnoticed if the air hadn't been so still. "Dr. Ellis," she said softly, "would you like anything? Coffee? Tea?" "Water's fine," he replied gently. "Thank you." "Of course," she said, with a tone that felt different now, less mechanical, more grounded, like she wasn't just addressing a passenger anymore, but someone whose quiet strength had reset the room. Grace Lynn reached across the aisle and gently touched Benjamin's arm. "That was the most important thing I've heard all year," she whispered. "Thank you." Anthony nodded too, speaking for the first time since the exchange began. "That right there. That's why I'm raising my sons to carry themselves like you, with calm, but never with silence." Kelly, clearly shaken but inspired, leaned over and added, "I'm sorry for not saying something sooner. You shouldn't have had to say all that just to prove you belong." Benjamin offered a kind, weary smile. "You didn't need to speak for me, but you did speak, and that matters." A few seats back, even a businessman who hadn't looked up once earlier now sat still, hands folded, eyes forward, not in discomfort, but in deep, visible thought. Benjamin didn't look for recognition. He didn't need to. He simply leaned back in his seat, lifted his cup of water, and took a long, slow sip. Outside the cabin windows, the tarmac gleamed under late afternoon sun. Inside, no one spoke, but everyone was listening. The cabin had fallen into a strange stillness, one that didn't feel awkward, but reverent, like a courtroom just after testimony that no one dares interrupt. For several minutes, the only sounds were the soft clinks of glasses being cleared and the distant whirring of the jet bridge pulling back. Then, without warning, the cockpit door opened and out stepped the captain. He was a tall man in his mid-40s, clean-shaven, with salt and pepper hair, a calm gaze, and the purposeful walk of someone who didn't speak often. But when he did, people listened. His name tag read, Captain Troy Daniels, and as he entered the first-class cabin, his eyes scanned the space, pausing only when they reached seat 1A, and then they lit up, not with surprise, but recognition. He stood still for a beat, adjusted his uniform cap, then stepped forward. "Dr. Ellis?" he asked, his voice carrying the quiet respect of a student greeting a teacher. Benjamin looked up, eyes calm, and offered a small nod. Yes? The captain's expression softened with something close to admiration. Sir, I studied under your lectures back at the Air Force Academy. Law and ethics in conflict zones. You probably don't remember, but your coursework changed the way I saw my entire role as an officer. It stayed with me. There was no dramatic gasp, no applause, but you could feel it. An emotional shift in the room so strong it felt physical. Peter Langston, still seated beside Benjamin, blinked. Once, twice. His body tensed like someone trying not to be seen. Linda, across the aisle, turned and looked at her husband again. Only this time, her eyes held something new. Not judgment, not defense, but distance. She was seeing him differently now, because sometimes the people we marry remain strangers until a moment pulls off the mask. Captain Daniels extended his hand. It's an honor to have you aboard, sir. Please don't hesitate to let us know if there's anything you need during the flight. Benjamin stood to shake it. Not for show, but because dignity demands that we meet honor with humility. Thank you, Captain, he said. That means more than you know. It meant something to me first, the captain replied, then turned to Maya. Is everything all right up here? Maya, who had stood quietly just a few feet back, gave a small, understanding nod. It's been addressed, sir. Daniels didn't push further. He simply nodded, then looked around the cabin. Not as a disciplinarian, but as a leader acknowledging the weight of what had just occurred. We're wheels up in 10, he said gently. Let's make it a peaceful flight, and with that, he returned to the cockpit, closing the door behind him with the same grace he'd carried in. For a moment, no one moved, not even Peter. He was sitting stiffly now, staring out the window, his jaw clenched not with pride, but with something far more uncomfortable. Realization. No words he could say now would fix what had just unfolded. He had tried to define Benjamin Ellis by a stereotype, and the man sitting beside him turned out to be a national voice in justice, an educator of military leaders, a bridge builder who could sit in the White House one day and row 1A the next. And the silence around Peter wasn't forced. It was earned. Kelly, still in 2A, whispered something softly to herself, like a prayer or maybe just an apology she wasn't sure how to say out loud. Anthony in 3A gave a single slow nod, as if to say, that's how you reclaim space, and Grace Lynn dabbed her eyes with a tissue she pulled from her purse. She wasn't crying because anything tragic had happened. She was crying because something sacred had, and sacred moments don't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes, they arrive through the power of restraint. Maya brought over a fresh glass of water for Benjamin and asked, quietly, "Would you like anything else?" "No, thank you," he said with a gentle smile. "You've done enough." But even in those 4 words, she knew what he meant. Not just her gesture, but her presence, her stillness, her humanity had mattered. Across the aisle, Linda Langston looked down at her hands. Her husband still hadn't spoken. Maybe he wouldn't. And maybe that was the beginning of something. Not healing, perhaps, but humbling. Because when a man sees the quiet fall of his own arrogance, the silence that follows is the start of change. Benjamin resumed his seat, adjusted his folder, and folded his hands gently across his lap. He didn't need the attention. He didn't require praise. What he had needed was what all of us deserve, dignity in our seat and respect in our space. And on that flight, in that cabin, at 3,000 feet, he didn't just get it, he commanded it. Not through status, not through anger, but through truth, spoken in stillness. And from that moment forward, no one looked at Seat 1A the same way again. The plane had reached cruising altitude, but inside the cabin, no one really felt like they'd taken off. The usual clinking of ice cubes and quiet hum of conversation that marked a first-class flight were gone, replaced by something more still, more thoughtful. It was as if the air itself had thickened with meaning. Benjamin Ellis sat in 1A, calmly sipping his water, eyes resting gently on the clouds outside his window, though it was clear he wasn't really looking at them. He wasn't escaping. He was centering, carrying the full weight of what had just happened, but not allowing it to anchor him. It was something he'd learned long ago, how to absorb, process, and release. Next to him, Peter Langston hadn't said a word since the captain shook Benjamin's hand. His arms were folded tightly now, not in confidence, but as a kind of shield, an instinctive retreat into himself. He stared forward with the 1,000-yard look of a man reckoning not just with someone else's strength, but with the limits of his own worldview. His jaw occasionally clenched, and his foot tapped beneath his seat. But he remained silent. His wife, Linda, seated across the aisle in 1C, had stopped trying to make eye contact with him. She was facing the window, quietly holding a paperback novel she hadn't turned a page in for the last 20 minutes. Her thumb rested between 2 chapters, unmoving. Whether she was reading or remembering, no one could say. But her body had gone still in that particular way people do when they know something inside them has been unsettled. A row behind. Kelly Burns sat with her tray down, a ginger ale in front of her untouched. She'd pulled out her laptop, but it remained unopened, her fingers hovering over the lid, unsure of what to do. She glanced up occasionally, her eyes drifting to Benjamin's row, then back to her drink, then back again. She wanted to say something. She didn't know what. She was the kind of person who believed she was aware, who had reposted quotes about justice and equity on social media, who'd signed petitions, supported causes. But witnessing something raw, face-to-face like this, it made all the theory feel small. She suddenly understood what it meant to be complicit through silence, and the knowledge sat heavy in her chest. In 3A, Anthony Price had stopped pretending to work. His laptop was closed, his seat reclined slightly. He'd removed his glasses and was rubbing the bridge of his nose. For him, this wasn't a surprise. It was a confirmation. Confirmation that even men like Dr. Ellis, men who had achieved everything society said would protect them, were still required to prove themselves in public spaces just to be left alone. He'd been that man too many times, though never with this much grace. And now, sitting here, he felt something between pride and sorrow. Pride for how Benjamin had carried himself. Sorrow that he had to carry so much in the first place. Anthony leaned slightly to the side and whispered, just loud enough for Benjamin to hear. "My sons are going to hear this story when I get home." Benjamin turned and gave him a nod. Nothing performative, just genuine acknowledgement. "Tell them," he said, "but tell them to stay soft while they get strong." From the galley, Maya Rodriguez reappeared with a tray of drinks. Her movements were more relaxed now, no longer bound by tension or hesitation. She stopped briefly at Benjamin's seat and asked softly, "Still doing okay?" "I am," he said. "Thank you for asking." "Thank you," she replied, then moved down the aisle. The kindness in her tone hadn't changed. It had deepened, and that shift didn't go unnoticed. Grace Lynn, in 3B, watched Maya with quiet admiration. She herself hadn't spoken since her earlier comment, but she didn't need to. Her hands, now folded calmly in her lap, reflected a peace that hadn't been there before. She turned slightly to Benjamin and said, "You gave us more than a moment. You gave us a mirror." He nodded, appreciating the honesty. "Sometimes," he said, "that's all we need to remember who we are." And though it wasn't directed at anyone in particular, somehow everyone nearby felt those words were meant for them too. Even the man in 4C, who hadn't looked up the entire flight, slowly pulled his headphones off and just listened. Something had shifted in the atmosphere. Not loudly, not dramatically, but meaningfully. Peter Langston, still rigid in his seat, finally moved. He reached into his bag and pulled out a bottle of water. As he twisted the cap off, his hand trembled slightly, and for the first time, he looked over, not directly at Benjamin, but toward the edge of his tray table. He opened his mouth, as if to speak, but no words came out, and Benjamin didn't rescue him from the silence. He let it stand, because some silences aren't meant to be filled. They're meant to be sat with. Linda caught the moment from the corner of her eye and said nothing, but her body relaxed just a little, as if she, too, was waiting to see what her husband would do with the discomfort he was clearly not used to sitting in. The seatbelt sign dinged. The captain's voice came over the speaker, calm and professional, letting passengers know they'd be arriving on time at JFK. But even that voice, so routine and rehearsed, felt a little more grounded now, like something had been added to the script. As Maya continued serving, as drinks clinked quietly onto tray tables, as people returned to their devices and magazines, there remained one unspoken truth, that this flight had become more than travel. It had become testimony, not because someone shouted, but because someone stayed seated and told the truth. The wheels touched down at JFK with a soft, steady thump. But it wasn't just the landing gear that settled. It was something in the air, something inside the people seated across that first-class cabin. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the usual rustling began. Tray tables clicked back into place, laptops closed, belts unfastened. But this time, it all felt slower, more deliberate. No one was rushing off the plane, no one eager to be first out the door. For a flight that had lasted just over 2 hours, the journey had felt far longer, measured not in miles, but in meaning. Dr. Benjamin Ellis remained seated, calm as ever, folding the leather folder neatly back into his briefcase. The photo of him and President Obama was tucked back where it belonged, not because he needed it hidden, but because he didn't need to prove anything anymore. Not here. Not to these people. Not after today. Next to him. Peter Langston had grown quiet in a way that didn't feel like defeat. It felt like introspection. His fingers rested still against the armrest they had once dominated. He didn't turn to speak. Not yet. But he didn't look away. Either. There was no smugness left in his posture, no muttered comments. Just a man sitting beside another man, realizing how little he'd ever really seen of the world beyond his own mirror, as the cabin doors opened and the jet bridge locked into place. Maya stood at the front once more, her posture relaxed, her smile no longer performative. She gave Benjamin a quiet nod of gratitude, not just for the way he carried himself, but for reminding her, and everyone else, what grace under pressure really looked like. Kelly stepped into the aisle first, before reaching for her carry-on. She turned slightly, looked at Benjamin, and spoke in a voice just above a whisper. "I hope your lecture in Chicago went well, because this one here, was unforgettable." Benjamin smiled. "Some of the most important lessons don't happen in classrooms." She nodded and stepped forward, eyes misted, face thoughtful. Anthony was next. He reached out to shake Benjamin's hand firmly. "Keep setting the standard. Sir, you raised the bar for all of us today." "We all carry the weight," Benjamin replied, gripping his hand in return. "We just carry it differently." Grace Lynn waited at her seat until the aisle cleared, then approached quietly. "My students will hear this story. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. Thank you. Then maybe it did some good, he said softly. And finally, Linda Langston stood. She looked at her husband, who still hadn't spoken, then looked at Benjamin. There was a long pause. Her expression wasn't proud. It wasn't ashamed. It was something in between, an acknowledgement of what had been revealed, not just about Peter, but about herself. I won't forget today, she said, and I hope he won't either. Then she gently touched her husband's shoulder, signaling it was time to go. Peter stood slowly, his movements deliberate. He reached for his bag, then paused, turned, faced Benjamin for the first time with no smirk, no judgment, just an uneasy honesty. I was wrong, he said, his voice gravelly. That's not easy for me to say. But I was. Benjamin didn't gloat. He didn't nod or shake his hand. He simply replied, with the calm of a man who'd been here before. It's not about being right or wrong. It's about choosing to see what's always been there. Peter nodded once, then turned and walked down the aisle behind his wife, a little slower than before. And when the cabin finally cleared and only a few passengers remained gathering bags, Maya stepped closer again. Dr. Ellis, that was more than a flight. I just wanted you to know I saw all of it. Thank you, he said. Most people don't. Well, she smiled. Maybe more will now. As he stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge, the cool, recycled airport air hit his face, sharp, but familiar. He walked with the same quiet strength he had boarded with, briefcase in hand, posture steady, not because of what had happened, but because of who he was. A few rows back, a child looked up from her window seat and whispered to her mother, "Who was that man?" And her mother replied, "Someone who reminded us how to be better." Outside, the city pulsed with movement, taxis honking, terminal screens flashing, lives rushing in every direction. But inside, for those few who had shared that flight, something had changed. A recalibration. A memory that would outlast turbulence and tail numbers. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone saw a man like Benjamin Ellis walking toward seat 1A, they wouldn't wonder if he belonged. They'd assume he led the flight, because leadership, after all, doesn't wear a uniform or a title, it wears character. And on Flight 227, character sat quietly in the first row, without ever needing to raise its voice. Thanks for watching. If this story touched you, give it a like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Take care, and we'll see you in the next one.